Thank you for downloading this Council on Foreign Relations video. CFR is an independent national membership organization and nonpartisan research center. For more information, please visit us online at cfr.org.
I'm Jim Hogue, editor of Foreign Affairs, and the moderator this evening. We start at 6. We'll be through on time at 7. This is an on-the-record meeting, but it's not on the record for your cell phones or anything else that you've got that's going to go beep beep in the night. So please check and turn them off if they are on. Now, it's a great pleasure to have Michael back here, and I say back here because he's a former senior fellow with the council, and he's also a prolific author, and we try to catch every book as it comes by. Tonight, we're here to discuss his latest book, the title of, thank you, Ed. The title is Democracy's Good Name, The Rise and Risks of the World's Most Popular Form of Government. And it's published by Public Affairs, whose distinguished founder is with us tonight, Peter Osnos. Michael is the Christian Herter Professor of American Foreign Policy at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C. As I said, he's the author of 10 books, including The Ideas That Conquered the World and The Case for Goliath. Michael, let's start with the subtitle of your book, The Rise and the Risks. And maybe we can get into the full rise a little later, but right now, how would you say democracy is faring right now, and what are some of the contemporary risks that we have to deal with?
Good. Well, first, Jim, let me thank you for presiding and thank our president, Richard Haas, for making this possible, and special thanks to Megan Mills of the council staff for organizing it. And let me acknowledge Peter Osnos and Whitney Peeling from Public Affairs, my publisher, and I also want to acknowledge one other person who's here who was responsible for this book, or partly responsible, and for many other books that I have written and others have written, and that is David Hamburg, the President Emeritus of the Carnegie Corporation, which was kind enough to give me a fellowship to work on this. And no author is an island, so I'm happy to acknowledge the people who've helped make this possible. Democracy rose remarkably in the last quarter of the 20th century for two reasons, or in two ways that I describe in the book. It became popular because the most successful countries of the 19th and 20th centuries turned out to be democracies, and the non-democracies turned out to be unsuccessful, and countries are like individuals, you might say like teenagers. They follow what's popular, what looks successful, what looks cool. And democracy was cool, but as I emphasize in the book, merely wanting to be a democracy doesn't get you there. You have to have the institutions, the skills, the practices, and I devote a lot of attention to the question of where these come from. And my argument is that they come chiefly from a market economy. The market economy is the template for and the parent of political democracy, in my view. In fact, if there is a hero of this book, it is the free market. Now, much of the book is devoted to making that case, but I also pay attention to the risks, and there are real risks to democracy. And in order to understand those risks, you have to understand how democracy is properly defined, and I devote the first chapter of the book to giving a proper definition. You might think that this isn't necessary. We all know what democracy is. We all live in a democracy. And it's true that the term democracy refers to a particular single form of government, but historically, what we know as democracy represents the fusion of two distinct political traditions that for most of recorded history, really until quite late in the 19th century, were not only separate, but regarded as completely incompatible. Those two traditions are popular sovereignty, ruled by the people, and liberty. Liberty meaning freedom. And liberty comes in three parts: economic liberty, namely private property; religious liberty, freedom of worship; and political liberty, the freedoms embodied in our Bill of Rights. And of these three, actually political liberty is the newest. Private property is the oldest, going back to ancient Roman times. Now, for most of recorded history, it was thought that if you gave people power, if you let people select the government, the result would be violence, chaos, and ultimately tyranny. This was thought to be the lesson of ancient Greece, and it also represented the view of the common people, widely held among the political classes. So people such as Tocqueville and John Stuart Mill in the 19th century, who saw democracy, social leveling, but also political participation coming, worried that what they valued most in politics, namely liberty, might be crushed. Tocqueville came to the United States in part to find out about the fate of liberty in a country where democracy was well advanced. And Mill wrote on liberty precisely to argue that there were certain precautions that could be taken to make sure that the democracy that was coming would not crush liberty. Well, it turned out that in the late 19th century, it was possible to meld the two, contrary to all expectations. And today, we don't think anything of the combination of the two. We don't think there's anything unusual about it, but historically, it is unusual. And I want to make one point about that before finally getting to the answer to your question. I believe, and I argue in the book, that one of the things that made possible the marriage of liberty and popular sovereignty, contrary to the expectations of the champions of liberty and contrary to some 19th century experience. After all, after the French Revolution, what the champions of liberty feared did occur. Property was confiscated, the property of the nobility and of the monarchy and of the church. So the coexistence of private property and political liberty on the one hand and popular sovereignty, rule by the people, free elections with universal suffrage on the other, is possible in no small part, I believe, because of the welfare state. The welfare state confers upon every citizen, by virtue of citizenship, a form of property, and therefore legitimates property in a way that was not true in the 19th century, and thereby legitimates one of the most important forms of liberty. So the modern democracy that we have consists of two political traditions, but it really has a third part. It really, I think, isn't possible or thinkable in the 21st century for an advanced industrial democracy to do without a welfare state of some kind. We argue about the dimensions of the social provision that we make, and that is, after all, at the core of our politics. But there is no question that we are going to have some sort of welfare state, and I think one of the reasons and one of the benefits of that is that it makes possible democracy. Now, what's wrong with democracy? Well, what's wrong with democracy, or what can go wrong, is if you have popular sovereignty without liberty. The danger is not what the champions of liberty thought it was in the 19th century, that is the confiscation of private property, although that is a possibility. The danger is, rather, that if you have popular sovereignty without liberty, you can have, and in many places do have, what Mill feared, namely the oppression of minorities. Majorities take power and do whatever they want to minorities and don't respect their rights because they don't believe in rights. They don't believe in liberty. And in the worst case, popular sovereignty, free elections, leads to conflict. And this is what we saw in the Balkans in the 1990s. After all, the leaders who led their countries to war, Slobodan Milosevic of Serbia and Franjo Tudjman of Croatia, were freely elected. And they were elected on platforms of fierce nationalism. When elections are first held in new democracies, there is an enormous temptation for the politicians to win votes by appealing to the basest, most reactionary, most aggressive impulses of the people. And without the protection of well-established liberty, that can lead to war, as it did in the Balkans. That's why some people, including, I believe, Larry Diamond, who has a very interesting article in Foreign Affairs in the latest issue, has written extensively on democracy and has a new and very interesting book out about the subject. He and others have recommended, or at least hoped for, a particular sequencing. There's no doubt that it's better to have liberty first, and then when it's established, have popular sovereignty, and that is how real democracy came to the world. Great Britain first had liberty and then gradually broadened the franchise, and that was true in the United States as well. The founders of the United States certainly didn't believe that they were founding a democracy, and in the early discourse of American politics, the word democracy was a bad word. It was almost as bad as dictatorship is today. It was a republic, not a democracy. So if it were possible in a place such as Iraq, it would have been better to take control of the place, pacify it, organize it, start a market economy which leads to the habits and the values that make a political democracy possible, gradually introduce the franchise after the rule of law has been established. But merely to describe that scenario is to make it clear what a fantasy it is in the 21st century. So there is a danger that when a country switches abruptly from a dictatorship to, quote, democracy, unquote, with no history or experience of liberty and conducts elections, the result may be even worse than life was under the dictatorship.
You mentioned that Great Britain and the United States, huge successes economically and otherwise, were one of the reasons why democracy spread, because it's a hell of an example. We also offered help here and there. My question has to do with a current risk, which is this phenomenon called authoritarian capitalism, in which the Chinese model is sort of the centerpiece. You can keep control of your politics and still go free market, satisfy your people, but don't have to give up your power. There's lots of chatter around the world that maybe this is the way for emerging countries to go. How much of a risk is this to democracy as we think of it, or is it a passing phase?
Very important question. In fact, that, of course, was put forward in an article a few issues ago by Professor Azar Ghat, and there's now a series of conferences organized to investigate precisely this issue. I am skeptical that this is a new model, that this will rival democracy. I do, in the last chapter of Democracy's Good Name, discuss the future of democracy in the three parts of the world where it is not present at the moment and where its presence or absence is, I think, most consequential for the world as a whole, namely Russia, China, and the Arab world. I'm rather optimistic in the long term about Russia, agnostic about China, and pessimistic about the Arab world, but it's Russia and China that are relevant here. I don't know what, and China is really the most important case. I don't know what's going to happen in China, but I am certain of two things. One is that China is much freer than it was 30 years ago, much freer than it was during the Maoist period, because in no small part of the workings of a market economy. That has generated and will continue to generate pressure for a more pluralistic, more transparent, more representative political system. Moreover, I believe that China will find that it needs to open up its political system simply to continue its economic progress. That is to say, the argument that wins with the Chinese leadership is not democracy is a good thing in and of itself, or the people should be able to rule, but rather if you want to keep the party going, if you want to keep economic growth going, you've got to release your grip at least to some extent. Well, I think that's going to continue to be true. I'll give you one example. The Chinese want to have and should have a first-class financial system. You cannot have a working first-class financial system without much more secure property rights and much greater transparency than they now have. So I think that for economic reasons they will be pushed in that direction, and that means there will be more and more liberty in China. On the other hand, there are important counterpressures in China, serious counterpressures. One is the party. As long as it remains united, it can keep the lid on. And this is a party that has not been discredited as the Soviet and Eastern European communist parties were in the 1980s and early 1990s. It's not weak. It has a certain legitimacy because it has presided over economic growth. Moreover, my sense is that there is a wariness among the Chinese people, including and in some ways especially the people who are natural democrats, natural allies of democracy, because China is a country, of all the countries in the world, it probably had the worst 20th century, the bloodiest, the most difficult, the greatest upheaval. Chinese people don't want to repeat that, and they are nervous about making changes that might call into question the prosperity and stability that they have already achieved. That said, however, the further they get from their turbulent 20th century, the greater the number of people in the middle class, the more private property there is, the greater the pressure will be to democratize the system. I don't know what the outcome will be. In the book, I suggest that we may see a repeat of what happened in 1989. There may be a countrywide crisis in which the government will have to make a decision about whether to liberalize or crack down.
That's the thing they fear the most.
Well, and they've worked hard to stop it, and they've been quite successful. But it may well be that one day they won't be. And as we know from the Tiananmen Papers, which Peter and Public Affairs published, what happened in 1989 was a close-run thing. It could have gone the other way.
Right.
It could easily have gone the other way. So I am not persuaded that China is a stable authoritarian model for the future. And by the way, China is not offering itself as a model for other countries in a way that communist China did, which is not to say that other dictators don't look at China and think, I'd like to achieve that myself. As for Russia, I'm actually optimistic about Russian democracy in 20 or 30 years. Putin is certainly not a Democrat, but my view of Putin is that he is a mere thief. He and his colleagues and his cronies are not in power to create some new kind of political system. They're in to steal as much as they can, and they seem to be doing a very respectable job of it. But if that's true, then they're really not much different from lots of governments.
But how about this, Michael? If you look at the long-term trends in Russia, you've got to be very concerned about what the country's going to look like, not 20, 30 years from now, but about 10 or 15 years from now. They have a terrible demographic problem. They have a terrible health problem. They have an economy and an agriculture which are being underattended because they've become a petrostate and are living off of high oil prices. Here they are back into the czarist mode of a centralized government. Isn't that likely to be even strengthened more as the situation gets more dire?
It could well, and what I say in the section on Russia is that I'm optimistic about Russia because the old obstacles to Western-style government have disappeared. It's not a nation of peasants. It's not threatened from the outside. It doesn't have a raging anti-democratic ideology. The real danger is oil. There is a danger that Russia becomes a petrostate, and countries that rely on oil tend not to be democracies because people want to hold on to power to continue to get rich, and because they don't develop the institutions of a market economy that ultimately lead to political democracy because they don't have to. So there is, I think, a real chance that Russia will not become a democracy, but that will swerve off into being a kind of giant Slavic Saudi Arabia, although with less oil. If that's true, it will be bad for Russia, it will be bad for the world, but I don't think it'll be a model for other countries, and particularly the terrible demographic trends that you note are dragging Russia down, I think ultimately will discredit Putin and will move the country to a more open kind of government. But if they don't, Russia will not be an attractive model. So I am quite open to the possibility that Russia may fail. I think that is a serious
Let me ask you about your third one, the Arab world, where we have been busily trying to implant a democracy in the middle of a ring of authoritarian governments without much success. I think we could all agree. Is there any possibility of democracy in that region anytime in the foreseeable future? Should it be fenced off for a while? Is there a better way to handle the problem than what we're trying to do?
If I knew the answer to the last question, you would have published it by now in Foreign Affairs. I think one can say at least two things in favor of the effort to promote democracy in Iraq. One is, if it could be done, I think it would have a ripple effect throughout the region. because people learn from examples, and they take most seriously the examples that are closest geographically and culturally. So, for example, democracy spread to Eastern Europe, I think, through Western Europe. East Asia got interested in democracy because Japan was so successful.
You don't think the authoritarian governments that would be surrounding this rather fragile democratic experiment would want to crush it to keep their regimes going the way they are?
Would and do, and have tried, and have had a lot of success. But I mean this in hypothetical terms. If it were possible to establish a stable democracy, we would get something out of that beyond Iraq, I think. And second, you cannot accuse this administration of taking on easy cases. This is where democracy is concerned. This is not low-hanging fruit. It's way up at the top of the tree. I think that the obstacles to democracy in the Arab world are probably more numerous and more formidable than in any other part of the world. So I think democracy has a steeper uphill climb there than anywhere else, including sub-Saharan Africa. I think for all kinds of, for cultural reasons, because these countries are so divided ethnically and religiously, and the more divided a country is, the more difficult it is to promote democracy, because of oil, because of
Islam. What role does that play in this?
Well, you know, I think if you take, there is a problem with the religion in this sense, that Islam, unlike Christianity, grew up as the religion of power. There was no distinction between church and state. There were the phrase "render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, render unto God that which is God's" makes no sense in Islam. And without secularism, it's difficult to have, for example, religious liberty. On the other hand, Islam is now an old religion. There are many forms of it. There are Islamic countries that are relatively democratic. Indonesia is not doing badly. Pakistan has some of the elements of democracy. A few Muslim countries in Africa are not doing badly. So I don't think one can... Islam is not necessarily an asset, but I don't think it is dispositively...
I don't either, but I think it's different in the Arab world. You made that point.
I think that's right.
There's a story in today's paper which I found intriguing, which is that Turkey has had this study going on for several years now on how can you update Islam and Sharia law and so on to bring it into the modern world. And they're about ready to unveil this. We shall see.
Well, my guess is that effort, which of course has to be an effort by and for Muslims, nothing that non-Muslims can do, that effort will be crucial for the chances of democracy in the Arab world. But that kind of effort, a reformation, if you want to call it that, or even a renaissance, you know, it wouldn't take as long as it did in Europe because everything moves faster now, but it won't happen overnight.
No. About to turn to the audience, so please, if you have a question, put your hand up, tell us who you are, and try and be succinct. I have one last question for you, Michael, about us. In the book, you say that the promotion of democracy is really built into the nation's political gene structure, so to speak. And the spectrum of how we approach it goes all the way from really a missionary zeal, Woodrow Wilson or Ronald Reagan, to realpolitik, which is the more democratic the world, the safer a place it is for us. Whatever part of that spectrum you choose, we have not really been having a lot of success of late. Number one, do you think we will now pull in our horns and go back to being the city on the hill, the exemplar, so to speak, but not that engaged in trying to promote democracy? Or, if we are going to continue, what have we got to do it better?
Good questions. Democracy promotion, in theory, dates from the founding of the Republic. But, as you rightly note, until the 20th century, until 1898, I would say, until the Spanish-American War, the United States promoted democracy by example, not by intervention. And the reason was the United States didn't have the resources, the means, wasn't powerful enough to intervene in other countries and try to promote democracy. And as I argue in the book, especially in one chapter, most successful democracy promotion is by example. And indeed, democracy has been successfully promoted, especially in the last quarter of the 20th century because it's no longer an Anglo-American or merely a Western affair. The more democracies there are, the more examples there are, and the more powerful the force of example is. So we will always promote democracy by example, and we won't do it alone. Democracy is no longer a Western form. There will surely be times when we try energetically to promote democracy, but let me make 2 points about direct democracy promotion. One is, although its relative importance in the spectrum of American foreign policy goals has waxed and waned, especially in the 20th century, reaching high points with Wilson, Reagan, and the second Bush, and lapsing back into the middle range in other presidencies, it's never really been at the very top. The United States has never fought a war, including the Iraq War, specifically and primarily for the purpose of promoting democracy. What happened in Iraq was we went to war for different reasons, found ourselves in charge of the country, and then, given the political culture of the United States and given the democracy wave of the last 3 decades, couldn't, in good conscience, say, well, these guys aren't ready for democracy, we'll just stick a strong man here and go home, although in retrospect, maybe that was the way to go. So democracy, I think, is unlikely ever to be the dominant motif in American foreign policy, although it will never be absent and its importance will rise and fall. Second, and I spend some time on this point in Democracy's Good Name, I don't think we know how to promote democracy. Or to put it differently, democracy cannot be promoted with the instruments of foreign policy that we have because democracy, in particular liberty, requires institutions. Institutions require people with the skills to operate them, and it requires that the values supporting those institutions, such as the rule of law, be diffused throughout the society. And that takes time. That cannot be done overnight, and it probably cannot be introduced from the outside under 21st century conditions. So we can do a lot, and we do a lot, and the world does do a lot to promote democracy by example. Promoting democracy directly, well, I have no objection to the National Endowment for Democracy or the Republican and Democratic institutes going out and training people. I think it's all fine work. But that's not really what counts. What counts is the internal dynamics in countries over which we really don't have much leverage.
One last question about us, democracy here at home. Since 9/11, there's been a pretty good give and take over whether we are slipping in some of the attributes of democracy, civil rights, protections, and so on and so forth. My question to you is, how serious is the slippage, in your opinion? Are the checks and balances of our government still relevant? Are we going through a period of tightening, but not one that will put us at a long-term disadvantage in terms of our democratic values?
I do not worry about American democracy. I think what we have seen since 9/11 is a rather familiar American pattern. Anytime there is a war or a foreign threat, people say and feel, and not necessarily wrongly, we may have to sacrifice liberties to some extent, perhaps temporarily, in order to make ourselves safe. After all, Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed the order to intern Japanese Americans. And at the time, this seemed a prudent, if not indeed a necessary response to what was thought to be a looming danger. Inevitably, as the danger eases, people begin to see things differently. They say, these infringements on our liberties are really not necessary, and indeed they're an affront to our values. And the political system begins to push back, and the circumscribing of liberty, which has been much more modest on this occasion than it has been in the past, relaxes. I think that is a normal pattern in wartime. It may not be an admirable pattern, but it's easy to see why it is part of our political culture and our political history, and that's what I think we are seeing now.
Some questions. Yes, sir. Richard.
Excuse me, I haven't read your book, so if this question is in your book, please excuse me.
Who you are.
Yeah, Rick Thoman,
Thank you.
corporate acquirer, CEO, and professor at Columbia. I wanted to talk a little bit about the future of democracy as you see it in view of two trends which affect liberty very differently. The economic trend of liberty, I think in a sense democracy grew up out of a sense where the nation state controlled things on an economic level and on a political level. And you could argue now the nation state is in a sense of being bypassed on the economic level. We're seeing global corporations, we're seeing regulation bypassing what needs to happen on a state level, and therefore the global economy is really one which is bypasses in many ways states. On the other hand, on the political level, we're seeing increasing local interests. We're seeing devolution in Scotland, we're seeing Quebec. So we're seeing the political level reduce, the economic level bypass the global level, the state level. What is the implication of all that for democracy as you look ahead?
Well, that's an important issue. I'm glad you raised it. I don't treat it at any great length in the book because it was outside the scope of the book, and it's a big issue that requires a book in and of itself. It's true that the scope and responsibilities of the state are changing, especially with more intensive globalization. And as the international economy becomes more expansive and more intensive, significant activity takes place on an international, not a national scale, and yet it needs some kind of regulation. And we don't have strong international bodies to provide that regulation. So the deficit in global governance is one of the problems the world faces in the years and decades going forward. And indeed, that is, I touch on that subject in a public affairs book I published in 2006 called The Case for Goliath, How America Acts as the World's Government in the 21st Century. But I think we're going to see some restraints on global governance and global regulation precisely because democracy is strong and people want government regulations to be passed and implemented by bodies over which they have democratic control. And that is the reason that democratic bodies, or one reason, that they're likely to remain relatively weak. It's one of the reasons, one of the many reasons, that the prospects for the United Nations are, I think, quite limited. It's a trade association of sovereign states, not a supranational government. It's not going to be. And because that is so, and because people demand democratic accountability, the potential for the United Nations is limited. So I think that although there's likely to be a tension between the growing need for international and supranational regulation, especially of economic matters on the one hand, and the demand for democracy, which really can only be carried out in practical terms at the nation-state level on the other, my guess is that for the foreseeable future, when those two forces come into conflict, it is the democratic forces which emphasize the importance of state sovereignty that will hold the upper hand.
Yes, sir.
Benjamin Barber, I'd like to follow on that question.
There's a mic coming your way.
Oh, thank you.
Hi, Benjamin Barber. I want to follow on that question. You started by defining democracy in terms of popular sovereignty. I think the thrust of the last question was to suggest that sovereignty itself is in a poor state, vanishing in some ways. And you just said that the real solution is democracy because democratic sovereignty will permit us to have the kind of control. But if, in fact, the forces of the economy and indeed of the environment and public health and crime and weapons have escaped the box of sovereignty, then insisting on democratic sovereignty as a solution to global problems which are beyond sovereign states and require, in fact, either some form of democratic oversight or regulation, or we will get anarchy on the one hand or the monopoly of illegitimate forces on the other. Your answer seemed insufficient to your own recognition of the force of globalization, which is really to take us outside of the nation-state box and say most of the challenges we face can no longer be answered by sovereign solutions.
Well, I don't agree that the forces of globalization are so powerful as to overwhelm internal state-centered democratic governance. Most economic activity still takes place on a local and state level. There is still a demand and a need for a welfare state, which will continue to be provided on a nation-state level. And most laws that are relevant to people are either national or local, not international, and therefore the nation-state will continue to be relevant. There are some issues, and climate change is one of them, that require international action. But since we are not going to have a global government, what is required is global cooperation. Cooperation among the nation states that will continue to be the basic units of world politics. And now we don't know how the 21st century will come out. They may prove inadequate. I'm neither optimistic nor pessimistic, but what I do believe is that in dealing with such global problems, to the extent that countries are democratic, they are more likely to cooperate effectively. And the track record in the 20th century is quite clear. International cooperation is much more intense and much more constructive among democracies. So to the extent that the world needs global governance, it is much better off to the extent that it is a world of democratic countries. Now, as I say, whether under the eyes of eternity that will prove adequate, only eternity will have the opportunity to know, but that is, I think, our best chance.
Let me sneak in a question on this subject, which is, in the book you mention trade and peace have a rather close connection, that good, healthy trade flows tend to damp down the need for conflicts. We're entering a period in which, after an awful lot of effort to continue to liberalize globalized trade and investment, we're hearing an awful lot of talk about protectionism, particularly in our election right now, but it's not just in the United States. If we do enter a period of reduced international trade and finance at a time in which the economies are also stalling, are we going to be raising the potential for a number of more serious conflicts than we see right now?
Good question. The idea that trade brings peace is an old English liberal idea dating from the middle of the 19th century. And in this book, I attempt to revive it, at least partly, by arguing that although trade doesn't guarantee peace, nothing can guarantee peace, there is some evidence and some reason to believe that to the extent countries are engaged in international trade, they have a disincentive to go to war. It doesn't mean they will never go to war, and we know what happened in 1914, but I cite both China and India, China and Taiwan, India and Kashmir, as examples where we have at least anecdotal evidence that the leaderships of these two countries are reluctant, hesitant, circumscribed in their policies dealing with these highly explosive issues of national identity for economic reasons. So it does act as something of a check on aggressive impulses, although it's not an impermeable barrier. But then there is no impermeable barrier to war. Now, we are in a period where there is a backlash against trade liberalization. As it happens, the subject I'm working on now is globalization. And there is a backlash against globalization. There was a backlash against the first period of globalization. There will always be a backlash against globalization because globalization disrupts. It diminishes some things while raising others. It is an example of Schumpeter's phrase that the free market works to bring about creative destruction. Globalization creates wealth, but it also destroys. It also jeopardizes people's livelihoods. It makes life more uncertain. People don't like uncertainty, and they organize to try to stop what they don't like. That is normal. It has always been the case. It always will be the case. Globalization is in trouble and always will be in trouble. My guess is that although there will be fits and starts, that the pace of trade liberalization will vary, that we won't go backward, that the the statements by the two leading contenders for the Democratic nomination for president last night to the contrary notwithstanding, we're not going to see a rollback in trade. What we are going to see is that the consequences of globalization and the political battle between the winners and losers from globalization will continue to be a central part of American politics. And I should say, getting back to my point about the social safety net being the compensation that allows the marriage of popular sovereignty and liberty, I think that to the extent that the United States and other countries do enter more fully into the global economy and are therefore subject to the disruptions that it invariably brings, political support for globalization does depend upon strengthening the social safety net. So it seems to me that the future of trade is probably tied, at least indirectly, to the future of healthcare in this country.
Yes, sir, in the back.
My name is Dalton Conley, New York University, and my question is if you could address the issue of ethnic heterogeneity and specifically the thesis of Amy Chua that in situations where there's a what she calls market-dominant minority group, then you actually have economic liberalization and capitalism in conflict with the spread of political rights and democracy more generally.
Well, it's a good question, and it goes back to my general point that it all depends on whether liberty is well established. There is an example of a country where a number of minorities have done extremely well economically, and yet this has not led to political instability, and that example is the United States. But the United States is not only a very rich country, it's a country where liberty is well established. It is actually the larger problem is simply with ethnic heterogeneity. Where you have religious or ethnic or national divisions, it's sometimes difficult to promote democracy because the different groups don't trust each other, and democracy does require trust. And in particular, it requires trust on the part of minorities that their rights will not be abused by majorities. And in the worst case, when you have plural countries where you have different ethnic and religious and national groups, not only do they not agree to live together in a democracy, they don't agree to live together in a single country. This is what we saw in the Balkans, and it's what we seem to have been seeing in Iraq. When you have a civil war, when you have groups that simply don't want to coexist in the same jurisdiction, not only do you not have democracy, you don't have a state. That is why, where you have this rampant pluralism, it is preferable for time to be permitted for the institutions and practices and habits of liberty to take hold. But in the circumstances of the 21st century, that isn't practical. So, but Mill, as long ago as I think 1865, an unrepresentative government, was very dubious that heterogeneous countries could have stable democracies. It's not impossible. They do it in Europe, but it is harder.
Now, we're somewhat of an exception. You point out in the book that what really has worked for us so far is that it is the principles of democracy or the philosophy of democracy that gives us our sense of identity as Americans,
Yes.
rather than ethnic or religion at first. Now, some sociologists and political scientists are saying that that may be changing, that we're moving more towards collective rights and collective confrontations, not hostile. But what's your own take on what's going on in this country on that score?
Well,
we remain an exception.
Sam Huntington, who's a great political scientist, wrote a book called Who Are We?
Exactly.
In which he argued that the Hispanic immigration to the United States is different from all others in that it is likely, for a variety of reasons, to make the United States a multinational country, which it's never been. The United States is not like Bosnia. It's not like Iraq. It's not a country which was formed when different groups who had lived in the same place for centuries were suddenly told that they were living in a single country. The United States is a country where individuals came as individuals with the presumption that they would accept American nationality. Sam thinks that the Hispanic immigration is different, and he worries, and I think he's right to worry, if it is true, that the United States may become for the first time a multinational state. And multinational states are much more difficult to govern and are difficult to govern according to the traditions and laws and institutions that have grown up in the United States than are homogeneous countries. There's been a debate, obviously, about this book, and the debate is really an empirical debate. It's about whether the Hispanic immigration is different. And as high as is my regard for Sam, I think he's gotten the worst of that debate. The evidence seems to suggest that Hispanics are no different from other immigrants, that they assimilate, that they intermarry, that they learn English. So I don't think that the basic structure of the United States, assuming the evidence that's adduced to counter his argument is correct, is in jeopardy.
Yes, sir.
Claude Erbsen, following up on what you just said, isn't there a danger that multilingualism and rather the bilingual education would foster this kind of thing? Instead of the family being responsible for maintaining the traditions, you do it in the public schools. It is my firm belief as an immigrant that had there been bilingual education when I came here at the age of 13, I would have never accomplished what I was able to accomplish, and that Henry Kissinger would never have been Secretary of State, and so on and so forth. How do you feel about that?
Well, that speaks to the question that Jim just posed. I think bilingual education is great because everybody should speak more than one language, and we're in a much more globalized, cosmopolitan world. So bilingual education is fine. A bilingual country would be a problem. We have where I live in a Maryland suburb, we have some neighbors who come from Lebanon, and they send their kids to a French lycée where they have bilingual instruction. So these kids are growing up fluent in French, but they're, to all appearances, normal American kids. They're certainly not going to have trouble functioning in the United States if that's where they choose to live. So bilingual education is fine. A bilingual country is a problem. I don't think we are heading in that direction. And that is true, and I'm not conversant with all the laws in different states, but I just don't see it happening, in part because you really cannot succeed in the United States. There's a ceiling to how well you can do economically if you don't speak English. So the incentives, whatever the school tells you, the real world incentives to learn English are just overpowering. I don't see that changing anytime soon.
Not particularly, Jermaine, but I can't resist the Kissinger story. You may have heard it. He has an older brother who speaks English without a hint of accent. And he was asked once, why do you speak like that and Henry has this thick... And he said, because I listen. Yes, sir.
I can't top that. Marty Gross.
Actually, Marty, you can top it, but you probably shouldn't try this group.
Right. Game face on. I'd like to take you back to the Middle East. You made the observation that for many different reasons, especially there, it's very difficult to either impose democracy or bring democracy or what have you for cultural reasons, etc. And your conclusion, which was pessimistic, I think, was that it has to come from within. Okay. Given our desire, the U.S.'s desire for many reasons, to see to it that that part of the world does start to democratize, and given what you said about how difficult that is, what would you recommend as the best strategy available to us to do the best we can under the circumstances?
Well, that's a very good question. I think we are doing the best we can, but and if current trends in Iraq continue, then it may, in a couple of years, be a relatively decent, relatively stable, rather partitioned place. But what level of American effort that would require for what length of time and whether the country is willing to furnish it, we just don't know. And so I wouldn't say I'm pessimistic about Iraq. I've never been there. And clearly the trends are better. But just based on my study of the nature of democracy historically and worldwide, I'm not optimistic about democracy anytime soon there, and therefore my policy prescription is different. It is to make the Middle East less important to us, which means having a completely different energy policy, and that gets us into a whole thicket, which we probably don't want to enter here, but which has been discussed at the Council in the past, and there's a terrific working group study, I think last year or the year before, and it's going to be an issue in the campaign. In fact, I sometimes, people ask me who I'm for in the election, I sometimes say I'm a single issue voter. I have one issue that I care about. I care about Japanese and European style taxes on gasoline in the United States, and whoever supports that I will vote for. I also, in my brief survey of the matter, I have not found a single elected official in the United States who is willing to advocate such a thing.
Ralph Nader?
I don't think even Ralph Nader. If Ralph Nader came out in favor of what I prefer, that would really test me. I'm not sure it would survive. So that's a very rough form of my answer to the question, what to do about the Middle East if we can't democratize.
Okay, Mike up here, Ted Sorensen. Coming, there you are.
I'm Ted Sorensen and Paul Weiss. I'm not concerned about ethnic and language tests of democracy. I'm much more interested in institutional and legal tests. Given the composition of our electoral college system, and for that matter, the United States Senate, and the tendency in recent years to change the law by executive order, to decide an election by a partisan Supreme Court, to bypass the Senate on appointments, how would you rank the United States on purity of democracy?
Well, as I say, I'm not worried about democracy. I think that the issues you raise, although serious ones, fall into the category of policy and even institutional differences within democracy. And I would also argue that, and I would emphasize, that liberty is a very important part of democracy, and most people, given the choice, and not all that many people are given the choice, would sacrifice popular sovereignty for liberty. They'd rather live in a well-ordered, free country than one in which they have a vote in choosing the government. And the evidence of that is the number of expatriates in the United States. There are lots of people who live here perfectly happily who can't vote. They don't feel particularly oppressed, and a lot of them could be citizens but don't. Having said that, the Electoral College is certainly an important issue for the United States. Whether or not and the Electoral College is, as you of course know very well, and I think most people here know, is a relic of the age, that is the writing of the Constitution, the late 18th century, when the last thing in the world the people who were in charge of the country wanted was popular sovereignty. It is a deliberately anti-democratic institution. The last thing in the world they wanted was for the common people to choose the president. The idea was that the state legislatures would nominate the best and the brightest among them, and they would go to Washington and bargain and come out with a first magistrate, who of course was not thought likely to be as popular as and as powerful as the 20th and 21st century American president is. Now, that institution has been adjusted with time, and the Electoral College is a mere fiction, but we are left with at least one undemocratic vestige, as we saw in 2000. It is technically possible with this system for the person who gets the largest number of votes not to win the presidency perfectly legally within the rules. I would say two things about that. First, that is an anomaly. I think that the movement to change the Electoral College has not been particularly powerful, not simply because some small states would lose power, but also because 2000 looks like an anomaly. It only happened once since 1876, and only once since there was genuine popular sovereignty in the United States. If it happens again, I suspect that the Constitution will be changed. The practical effect of it, of course, is that because the contest for electoral votes is winner take all in each state, and because our politics are so polarized and most states are not available to one party or the other, the presidential campaign takes place only in the swing states, only in 12 or 13 or 15 states. So we probably ought to prefer the abolition of the Electoral College and the movement to a French-style system wherein wherein there's a national election and the person with the greatest number of votes wins, or with a majority of the votes, because of course in France there's usually a runoff, so then we'd have a two-stage presidential system. But the argument in favor of abolishing the Electoral College is first that it does produce the anomalous outcome we saw in 2000, but second, it's not democratic in that a large part of the country doesn't really participate in the presidential election.
In the back, young lady.
Ying Ma, Simpson, Thatcher, and Bartlett. By placing so much emphasis on economic freedom as a vehicle for promoting democracy, do you think that it creates a certain danger or a certain laziness in thinking about other instruments that we can use to promote democracy? So, for instance, in China, it does make a huge difference if China democratizes in 10 years versus 50 years. If we rely on economic freedom and we don't even know, there's a chance economic freedom may lead to political freedom. We don't know that for sure. But in the meantime, do we have a plan B? Along those same lines, a lot of various other scholars have argued that the United States and the NED and various other institutions have done actually a great deal to promote democracy in countries like South Korea, in the Philippines, and the means used were not always economic means. So I wonder if by placing so much emphasis on economic freedom that, and you spoke of NED before, somewhat dismissively, that maybe you're dismissing those other means a little too readily.
Fair question. It is certainly true that the analysis relies very heavily on economics. It verges on economic determinism and on a dreaded syndrome in social science, the monocausal explanation. I just got a review in which somebody said, Mandelbaum lists a whole catalog of causes of democracy, and I'm tempted to write a letter saying that's completely wrong. I list basically one cause. You can accuse me of being too narrow. That's a fair accusation, but not of being too broad. And I was more polite about the NED and other organizations than I usually am. I'm not in good favor there for reasons that are obvious from my analysis. And the reason that I don't suggest a plan B, and Larry Diamond's book is an example of somebody who really does believe in the tools of democracy promotion, who's been involved in them. And so if you read his book, you will get lots of options for dealing with countries such as China. My view, honestly held, based on my analysis, is there is no plan B. We really don't have much in the way of leverage over China, or even over countries that are much smaller, much weaker, and much closer to us in different ways. I wish that were not so. I wish we had more leverage. I think the world and China would be better off were China a democracy, although, let me emphasize, a real democracy with liberty institutionalized, not just elections, because as a knowledgeable observer said to me, if there were free elections in China, they'd vote for Mao. So my view, and it is certainly not the view of the democracy promotion community, and it's certainly not the only scholarly view, and it's certainly not the most hopeful scholarly view, is that the tools that we have, the United States and the rest of the democratic world, for promoting democracy within countries are very, very limited indeed. And as examples, I would point to Haiti, which we occupied and is no nearer democracy. I would point to Bosnia and Kosovo, which are not on the road to democracy. And I would point to Iraq. Now, Germany and Japan are counterexamples. I think they are counterexamples that prove the rule. They were countries that had had previous experience of democracy. They had the institutions necessary for democracy, especially well-developed market economies. And we were able to occupy those countries for generations without the opprobrium of being an occupier because we were defending them. And I think the American presence, especially in the first post-war decade, was important in keeping Germany and Japan on a democratic track. So my judgment, and there are people who've studied this issue as thoroughly as I have and come to a different judgment, but my judgment is we don't have a plan B.
We're just about out of time. I want to say as we close, Michael is one of the most elegant and accessible writers in public affairs I know. And this book is no exception. When I was reading it, I kept feeling my gray cells feeling invigorated by the challenge of the arguments and how beautifully they are made. We have some books here. Michael is here to sign them. I certainly recommend them to you. Now join me in thanking him for a very good discussion.
Thank you for listening to this Council on Foreign Relations podcast. For additional audio, video, and transcripts of CFR meetings, as well as expert analysis of international news, please visit us online, cfr.org.